And we are so thrilled to have you with us today, Ruth.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Dalton, and to HealthTree. And hi, everyone who's joined us. It's wonderful that we have so many people who have joined. And it's nice to be a guest on this podcast. So many thanks. Really, the thing I really want to start with is that being here today, feeling and living well in quotes, right, is really a direct result of groundbreaking medical research, which of course could be seriously compromised in the next several years, but that's another conversation for another time.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's sometimes difficult to separate cancer science and politics. But we'll try hard today to put that in this box while we talk about this box, right? So let me tell you a little bit about my story because that's what I've been asked to do. I've been living with a myeloproliferative neoplasm, or MPN, for 30 years. It started out with ET, essential thrombocythemia. It progressed to PV, polycythemia vera, and now MF, myelofibrosis, or the dreaded myelofibrosis, because that's the most life-threatening of the MPNs. So I was diagnosed when I was 38, which is young. It's typically diagnosed in 50s and 60s, those that's starting to change as people, clinicians recognize it younger. But I was told when I was diagnosed with ET at 38, raising two young kids, that it won't affect my life much. I should take an aspirin a day and really don't worry about it. But the truth is that was 1995 and they knew very little. So I did go on and live my life, and I had the privilege of having a cancer that was invisible and I didn't have to talk about and didn't have to deal with until one day when I wound up suffering with severe pain in my abdomen, really not one day, but over several weeks, finally going to the doctor one day and finding out I had a clot in my portal vein and my splenic vein, which is very common with MPNs, because what happens is your platelets are very, very high, and so you're at risk for clotting. And so I dealt with that with low dose chemotherapy drugs, oral drugs for a number of years. Again, was told, live your life, live healthy, don't really worry about it much. And over about 10 years, it progressed to polycythemia vera, which is the opposite, right? Your platelets come down, but your red cell go up. So you go from being at risk for clots to being more at risk to bleeding, for bleeding. But in fact, PV comes with a high risk of clotting as well. So I was actually at that point diagnosed with early colon cancer, very early. And they took out 10 inches of my colon, and I was doing amazingly well. I was walking down the hall, with my pole, and they sent me home a day early because I was doing so well. And 48 hours later, I had a major hemorrhage, and I was not only back in the hospital, but in the ambulance to a major medical center and in the ICU for 5 days, et cetera, et cetera. So as part of my story and why I have written this book that Dalton mentioned, called The Big C Squared, Stories from the Chronic Side of Cancer. The reason I did that and the reason I've become an advocate is because I had to learn to self-advocate. There was very little known and very little awareness and advocacy and information about MPNs at the time. So, for instance, when I was diagnosed with colon cancer and I knew I was going into surgery, I said to my surgeon, I went through all of my medical history and I told him exactly what I was concerned about. I was concerned about, yes, I had had clots, but I'm also concerned about the risk of bleeding. And he put his hand on mine and uh, very kindly, we'll use it, say that, very kindly said, "Oh, don't worry, we've got you, honey. And your blood counts look fine, and your platelets are in a fine range right now." And I tried to explain to him, because I had educated myself, that yes, I know my counts are right. I have the right number of platelets and the right number of red cells at the moment. But that doesn't, and my hemoglobin being red cells, but that doesn't mean they'll function properly. So I just want to put it on your radar that I am at risk of bleeding. And again, he says, "Don't worry, we've got you covered." And 4 days later, I have this major hemorrhage and I'm in the ICU, and it was followed by months of healing. And that's when I really decided to take my own health much more seriously than the medical community was at that time. Again, it was early on. And in fact, MPNs weren't even called MPNs. ET and PV were called blood disorders. And it wasn't until 2008 that they were reclassified by the WHO, the World Health Organization, as blood cancers. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But self-advocacy is a big part of my story, and anything I can do to help others is really what my goal is in life. And so I'm a health and science writer. I'm a freelancer. I've made a living as a writer for 40 years. And what's happened is that over time, my writing world has gotten smaller and smaller, and I report almost exclusively on cancers these days. So it was just before, oh, and one more thing, I entered when I was diagnosed with myelofibrosis after a bone marrow biopsy, which I'm up to 12 or 13, I've lost track. I went on a clinical trial that has really changed my life. So it was just before the world shut down that I started my clinical trial drugs. And I'm now doing so well that my doctors call me the poster child for clinical trials. So some good things did happen by the end of the COVID pandemic, right? One of the things is I was able to dance at my son Zach's twice postponed wedding. If it had happened as planned a few years earlier, I might not have had the energy to walk across the dance floor. So we try to button that up into the good things that have come out of that pandemic. So also in the midst of this raging pandemic, I edited 6 books, I ghost wrote another one, and I published a children's book. But honestly, that's not the work I'm most proud of. In March 2021, I pitched a story to the New York Times editor that I worked a lot with about MPNs, the elusive blood cancers that most people had never heard of. And I had planned to do an interview with specialists until the editor said, no, we want you to write this piece first person. And I'm like, well, I don't write first person, but I decided to. And the story was published in the Times newsletter called Well on a Thursday. And on Sunday, my phone rang. And it was my son, Max, asking me if I had seen the Times yet. And I hadn't. So I opened it up on my laptop, and there was my story, an editor's pick, right on the Sunday homepage. So what I wanted to share is that it isn't that the Sunday byline gave me, a heart sing. It was the outpouring of thanks that I received from hundreds of patients and family members, caregivers, practitioners. Because at the time there really wasn't much written about MPNs, and people struggled how to explain it to others. It was a story that I was pleased would help others. And slowly, as I mentioned earlier, my writing world became this little niche into how I could help people with all different types of cancers. And I realized early on that what is now really my mission in life is to make the distinction between acute cancers and chronic cancers, because most people, including most practitioners, don't make that distinction. And certainly our friends and loved ones, no matter how supportive they want to be, don't always understand that difference, right? So over time, I became a patient advocate through my work in that area. And now this book, The Big C Squared, has finally become available, and it's a very intentionally short book. It's a collection of essays and interviews that I wrote with the intention both to inform and inspire, but most important, it's to help to change the conversation around chronic cancers, which I coined the Big C Squared. So why is this important? It's important because the result of our great medical advances in medicine are that millions of people are now living with productive lives, right? Like myself and many of you. But we still talk about cancer largely the same way as we did 30 years ago, right? So even after a day I couldn't get out of the recliner, I would hear, but you look fine, right? I don't have to tell this audience what that means. You get it. And I could always smile at that being a well-meaning comment. Um, but people like myself and like people on this call, I presume, um, they can feel like a cancer imposter. They can feel invisible, misunderstood by comments like that. I remember times I felt very self-conscious being in a waiting room in a leukemia clinic where I go every 3 weeks for this clinical trial that I'm on. sitting in a clinical trial or sitting in a clinical leukemia waiting room with my really long down to my waist, very curly hair, which was this big at the time, and feeling, like an imposter. I was surrounded by people who were wearing wigs and head wraps, and here was I looking and feeling pretty well. And did I really have a chronic cancer? Of course I did, but you don't always feel that way. So that's something that I like to talk about because I think there's two sides to that conversation. One is us as people living with a chronic cancer. We have the opportunity to talk more about it and to educate the people in our lives, how we feel, how we want to talk or don't want to talk about living with a chronic cancer. It's a choice, and all of us are different. And we also have an opportunity to make it more public, really an awareness campaign, as I'm trying to do, where more people, even the clinicians we come in contact, like for instance, when you come in contact with someone in a in an acute situation, an urgent care, they have no idea what about the diseases we live with, and therefore they don't necessarily understand or speak our language. Oh, are you feeling better now? Well, yeah, I'm feeling great, but that doesn't mean I don't have a chronic cancer, right? So I'm on this mission to change how we think and speak about cancers that are chronic. So more family and friends, and yeah, even the practitioners that we see, that they understand more about the very real emotional effects of cancer. And that's whether it's a chronic cancer like mine or like CLL or like many times multiple myeloma, because while we have great treatments, it's still not a cure. So even if we have one of those chronic cancers, we might also have long-term effects, emotional effects from an acute cancer that was treated or cured years ago, right? So that's what I mean by living with a chronic cancer. It isn't just a quote chronic cancer, it's the chronic effects
Hmm.
and often long-term chronic effects of people living with cancer and it might already have been treated or cured. So in that spirit, I'd like to read a very short excerpt from the Big C Squared. It's an essay called Ringing the Bell, and I read it because I hope it gives you some feeling of, oh, someone else understands and I'm not alone.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read it as opposed to tell you about it. In the occasionally snow-capped Tucson mountains hangs a spectacular hand-tooled gong that reflects the bright Arizona sun and sparkling starry nights. Nearly 6 feet in diameter, it prominently stands at the entrance to a magnificent health and lifestyle resort. I was privileged to be a part of a small-scale conference for cancer advocates there in 2022. Throughout the life-altering 4-day sessions, attendees dug deep into what it means to live with a cancer, to survive a cancer, to thrive after cancer was hopefully done wreaking havoc on their body or that of a loved one. It was a very diverse group, very accomplished from every region in the country. And nearly every day, someone spoke about when I finally rang that bell, a common euphemism for reaching the end of successful treatment, perhaps being cured with no sign of cancer. For 4 days, I empathetically listened to the challenges of their health journeys and the successes that led to newfound roles as cancer advocates. I emotionally shared their joyful, moving stories, how they gratefully reached the other side of their cancer, whether for now or forever. Conversations about being alive for their friends, spouses, parents, and young children were stunning in their intimate, raw, and in their intimate insight, raw and enlightening. As this extraordinary meeting unfolded, a few of us began to compare our very different experiences. We are living with chronic cancers, which means we will likely be in some form of perpetual or maintenance treatment for as long as we live and breathe. Our cancer might stay the same or progress to another stage, but we do not expect a cure. The good news, we are here, living with, most of us thriving with, a cancer that we are able to manage, though sometimes better than others. The challenging news, we will not likely ring that bell. So as the group scattered to pack their bags with motivational to-do lists in hand, a few of us gathered at that giant gong. It took the strength of determination to lift the heavy mallet and take each powerful swing. Together, we heard and felt the awe-inspiring inspiring vibration of this Asian instrument. Individually, we each had our moment. It was a gift. Our bell was rung. So this is a chapter, a reading from a chapter called Affairs of the Heart. And I'll leave it to you, Dalton, at this point, where we go from here.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that reading. That was
Sure.
beautiful. I wish I could write like that. Um, and just thank you for sharing your little bit of your background and your story. And this is really what I wanted people to see is you are an advocate, obviously, for MPNs, but really for the chronic cancer space as a whole. You're trying to raise some awareness of what living with these chronic cancers is, and what that experience is like. So that's really why I wanted to invite you on, because I think you are such a wonderful advocate for that.
Thank you.
Um, so first and foremost, congratulations. And we are so happy to have you here. And 30 years after your initial diagnosis, we are thrilled to have this conversation right now. But I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more. So you mentioned that you have been living with an NPM for about 30 years now. But how did you really get involved into or I guess how long have you been in the advocacy role?
Sure.
You kind of talked about how you got into it, some of the things you've done here and there, but I'd really love to hear about how you stepped into that, what kind of pushed you to do that, and how um, you really took that next leap into advocacy, and
Sure.
maybe we'll inspire some others here.
Sure. So first of all, I was a New York Times stringer, and if you know what that means, you're old, you're as old as I am, basically a regular contributor. And at that time, I still filed this is making me feel very old. I still filed my stories like on the phone, called them into an editor and said dash dot. Or as time went on, I would fax them. And then one day I said to my editor, do you is there a way for me to email this to you? That seems logical. And he said, and this is an editor at the New York Times Metro section, and he looked and he said, well, he was on the phone, but I heard his voice and his pause, and he said, I don't know. Let me go in the basement and find out. So I tell you that story because that's how much our world has changed in such a short period of time, right? So I was a freelancer for the Times. I was a writer as a living, pitched the story about MPNs. And when I had such a great response, that's when I realized what the gap was in knowledge. And I thought, I really need I am in a unique opportunity to do something about that. So I started reaching out to others about writing assignments in that space, and then they started coming to me, and I started hosting webinars and doing interviews with renowned cancer specialists, attending advocacy organizations here and globally. And I learned a lot. I learned an awful lot. So was able to take my own experiences and relate them to how I can help others self-advocate or advocate for the others in their lives. So the perfect example, I'm a really hard stick for a blood draw. An IV is nearly impossible. The last time I had an IV, they had to go into a deep vein in my arm with a tube about this long after trying 8 times. So I remember when I was in the hospital for with a major hemorrhage, as I mentioned earlier, and telling the IV nurse or the ICU nurse that I was a really tough stick. And they were taking blood as they do in the hospital several times during the day. And I said, can you put something in, for an open access because I'm really a tough stick. And this was after a phlebotomy team coming in and out many times. And she said, oh, I'm sure I could do this. This is an ICU nurse. She does it all day long. She couldn't get me. So she said, okay, I'm going to have not a port, but an access point so that we don't have to be frustrated. You don't have to deal with this. Had I not pushed the envelope in that situation, it would have been difficult for me and for everybody over the course of 5 days, being stuck so many times. Now I had blood work done yesterday because I have to have blood work done every 3 weeks. And
Mhm.
before anybody, these phlebotomists have a chance to say, most of them will say, oh, don't worry, I do this all day long. When you start to say, I'm a tough stick. But for me, I've learned to push that. Oh, I know you do this every day. And I know you even deal with people with bad veins all day, but here's the lay of the land. This arm is useless. This arm, is full of scar tissue. You might get luck higher than the scar tissue, but probably not. Please just go in my hands,
Yeah.
because phlebotomists don't want to go in your hands. They're trained to do that as a last resort. So that kind of advocacy, that's just one example. Also, when I was in the hospital, another time I was delivered a little white cup with a drug that I'd never seen before. And I was told it was ordered for me because of my um, hypertension.
Mm.
But the hypertension that I had was from this portal vein thrombosis. So, in other words, a clot in my portal vein. And so I have liver hypertension or portal vein hypertension. And so I knew that that drug was not good for me, or I certainly wasn't going to pop it until I knew whether it was good for me. So I called my specialist and she said, nope, it has side effects that aren't good for you. And, looking at blood cancer holistically, or high blood pressure, or um, looking at things holistically, whatever it is, isn't the right thing. So that
Mhm.
brings me to advocacy to get to an MPN specialist or a CLL specialist or a myeloma specialist, whatever you're living with or your loved one is living with. These are all rare cancers. And what that means is that even though we all start out, and many of us continue to see a community-based hematologist or hematology oncology specialist, think about how many different cancers they have to juggle. So they don't know nearly as much as probably we do. Patients are the real experts, right? And they certainly don't know as much as what I call a super specialist, in my case, an
Mhm.
MPN super specialist at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York. My local hematology oncologist helped me find her, because after this catastrophic months of healing, I was determined to see a specialist. And what I like to include in the advocacy conversation is always get a second opinion.
Yes,
And if you're seeing it,
absolutely.
yeah, and if you're seeing a doctor, by the way, interject anytime. If you're seeing a doctor who thinks you don't need a second opinion, or is insulted by you needing, their ego is insulted by needing a second opinion, my advice is find another doctor, because every doctor I know who is a good physician and who is interested in your emotional and physical health will welcome another pair of eyes and ears, and in particular, the specialists. And the other side to that is that it doesn't mean you have to pick up your life. For me, I travel 3.5 hours each time, 3.5 hours round trip. So 7 hours to see a specialist every 3 weeks. And I'm in a position, I made that work, even though it's not easy. Most people are not, or a lot of people are not close to a major academic center. They're not able to do that, whether it's financially or daycare or employment issues. We have all kinds of reasons, right? But the experts that I know, almost all of them will do virtual consults. They'll give you a second opinion virtually. They'll work with your doctor virtually, your community practitioner. And so you get the benefits of local care with the expertise of someone who really knows the ins and outs, and most importantly, the latest research and the latest thoughts on treatments. Perfect
Um,
example, clinical trials. Like, I'm on a clinical trial, and that most trials aren't in a community setting.
mhm. Yeah, I think
Go
I
ahead.
love so much what you just brought up there of really being an advocate for yourself is really important on, hey, I'm a tough stick. Don't go in my arm. It's not going to work. You're going to waste my time. You're going to waste your time, and it's not fun for anyone. It's really having the voice to advocate for yourself is such an important skill for patients to learn. So I think highlighting that is really important. And then also, I love that you had the call out for the specialist because that's something that we here at HealthTree really believe in is in order to get the best quality of care, you do need to have at least a consultation with a specialist.
Yeah.
At, like you mentioned, a lot of them are able to do some telehealth visits. They are used to working with community oncologists in order to make something work, but it's really important to have that second set of eyes that are really trained and really focused on what is the latest and what is the greatest for this specific type of blood cancer because not every community oncologist, they don't have the time to do all of that. So they are all wonderful, but it's not, that would be a Herculean task to take
Yeah.
on for everything.
Exactly. Perfect example. So I'm not only living with a chronic cancer, my husband was recently diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and he's in treatment, active treatment. So I'm a care partner and a cancer, living with a chronic cancer. So I've sort of lived both of those worlds simultaneously. But we went to New York, got a consult and actually bone marrow biopsy and initial blood work, et cetera, a diagnosis and a treatment plan from a myeloma specialist. But his treatment is local. Literally, you could see it out my back window. The hospital is so close. So that's a perfect scenario for me. Um, the other thing I thought might be helpful to talk about in terms of advocacy is how we can play a role, and I alluded to this earlier, we can play a role in how others deal with us, because something
Mhm.
that makes us feel very unseen and misunderstood is how other people speak to us, right? Or about us. And so I think about that phrase, but you look fine. Um, and we can help others by even making subtle suggestions. Somebody can say, or there might be some care partners on the call today, instead of just saying, well, but you look great, that's not always the best medicine, right? it
Yeah.
it can it can be replaced by, well, you look great, how are you doing today? Or I'm so glad we could meet today. And that opens a door. It's not, instead of making us feel like, oh, I look fine. Well, I'm great. I look fine. I'm really grateful to be feeling fine. But that doesn't mean that I didn't have an event yesterday that I couldn't get out of the recliner, right? So it opens the door for us to talk about the challenges that we face, acknowledging that some days we have more challenges than others, right? And another example of that is, I hear this all the time, or you're lucky that your cancer is in the past. Um,
Hmm.
or you're lucky that you weren't very sick. Well, both of those things make us feel like an imposter at some level, right? So I like to say it becomes difficult for me to keep my raised eyebrows in place when somebody says you're lucky your cancer's in the past, because especially if you suffer from daily complications or the anxiety of periodic scans or the stress of uncertainty in the case of the many of the chronic cancers, when and if our cancer might progress or return, it can be, that is living with chronic cancer. Our cancer is not over, right? And similarly, we have the opportunity to tell the people we know and love how we want to talk about cancer. So we have the ability to recognize that the people around us, however well meaning they are, don't know how to talk to us about our cancer. So we can say, like for me, I'll just speak for myself. When I go out socially, I don't want to talk about being my illness or anyone else's. I want to
Yeah.
be me, who happens to have a chronic cancer, right? I want to be social and enjoy myself and not talk about how I might have not felt well this week. But people in our lives don't know that if we don't tell them, right? People are not used to, I know I'm saying this over and over again, but people aren't used to chronic cancers. They're used to an acute cancer that you get radiation or you get your surgery or chemotherapy and you move on. So talk to the people you know and love and say, you know what? Let's make a rule. Let's talk about how I feel or you feel for the first 5 minutes and then move on. Right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because that's not who I am, and that's not what I want to
And
talk about.
exactly. And I think, again, such an important thing to highlight is even though you're living with these chronic cancers, that does not define everything about you. You're still Ruth. you still love the same things. It does not define everything about you. So I think that's a really important thing. And figuring out the right way to have those conversations with people is also super important. And that's a question that I see all the time of how do I tell my loved ones that I have CLL? It's a chronic cancer. How do I, or an MPN, how do I even explain this to them? No one's heard of this. I have cancer now, but I don't go in for chemo all the time. I don't like that experience is very different and in a lot of ways kind of alien to so much of the general population that that's where the work that you're doing, trying to really spread the word about chronic cancer and what living with these conditions is just so important. I did want to ask one more thing
Mhm.
before we get into the Q&A here is so we're talking a lot about how living with the chronic cancer or living with these chronic cancers can be a challenging thing because you kind of feel like you have to explain your situation or people don't know how to have that right conversation. How have you been able to find community for chronic cancer? Kind of that sense of people that understand a little bit more of your experience. Have you been able to find that? And if so, how?
It's a great question. So again, when I was diagnosed, and really for the first 25 years that I'd lived with an MPN, I had never met anyone who had what I had. So there was no community, there was no internet in the beginning. Even when there was internet, there wasn't online resources, or there was very little. Certain communities have been better than others. Myeloma is a perfect example. HealthTree has built that community. The breast cancer community has been strong. In lots of other cancers, chronic cancers like MPNs, I believe CLL and some others have become stronger and stronger over time, as have MPNs. But I got into this at a time where everything was exploding in the last 3 years, 5 years, certainly 10 years. Knowledge has exploded, our understanding, scientific advancements, clinical trials, and indeed the community. So I'm trying to help create that community around the larger chronic cancers as opposed to each individual blood cancer in this case that we're talking about. And the reason for that is that if you're a CLL patient, or a person living with CLL, you have a very different experience than someone who's living with AML, who may be doing really well, certainly isn't cured, but has lasting emotional effects, if not physical effects, for a very long time, or someone who's living with multiple myeloma who goes into remission.
Mhm.
That's not without the very real anxiety of worrying about it coming back. So I think by building a community of people who are living with different chronic cancers, we come to the table with different experiences and different ways to help each other. Right. The more
Yeah.
we learn, the more we help each other. So another perfect example. And then we will get into the Q&A. So one thing I picked up somewhere was, I talk a lot about decision making, a decision making as a shared partnership between you and your doctor. I've had the
Mhm.
privilege of taking the stage with some magnificent, internationally recognized doctors to talk about this issue. And somebody said to me, "Oh, I think of it as a doctor's appointment." I was saying, we need to make the most, and I've been writing about making the most of our 17 and a half minutes with our doctors, right? And someone said to me last week, "Oh, I enter an appointment like it's a business meeting with an agenda
Hmm.
and all my Q&A, my questions written out, goals of what I want to walk out of that meeting with." And that's brilliant, right? We wouldn't walk into a business meeting without being prepared. So we always hear about writing out questions, collecting questions along the way. So by the time you go to your doctor, you know what those are. But putting that analogy made it very real for me. Make it a business meeting and be a partner in your decision making by advocating for yourself, but also learning more about how to make that happen. One of the ways in my book, I have a chapter called "Listening is an Art Form," and I
Mhm.
interviewed a doctor I adore, whose name is Dr. Gabby Hobbs, who's an expert in leukemia. And the whole chapter is about talking to and about chronic cancers. And one of the things that she talks to clinicians about in this book is about how to turn open-ended questions into turn them into meaningful discussions, not just how are you feeling, or have you been fatigued, or are you feeling any pain? Those are the standard questions. We as advocates, as people living with chronic cancers and our care partners, can help turn that around if our clinicians are asking us open yes or no questions. Let's help turn the conversation by helping them. They need our help, right? Let's help our
Yeah.
clinicians turn those yes and no questions into open-ended questions. And it helps us remember too. So for instance, I would go into an appointment and be asked, so how are you feeling? And I'd say, oh, I feel great. I'm great. But if I thought about it and someone actually asked me, okay, how are you feeling today, a week before your 60th birthday versus a year ago, a week before your 59th birthday? And when I thought about it like that, I thought, okay, well, I used to ride my bicycle 30 miles and now I can ride my bicycle on a flat road for 3 miles.
Yeah.
So we can help. Part of advocacy is helping our care team because they need our help.
Yeah. And again, everything that you've said, I think is so important. But
Well, I'm
yeah,
glad.
really being an advocate for yourself and advocating to your care team is a huge part of that. Um, but as promised, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A. So I'll share my screen real quick here. We do have a couple of questions in currently. Couple of these are actually related to your clinical trials. So, um, this individual has a couple of questions that they're asking about the clinical trial. So if you're able to share any information about your trial, how long you've been on it, or if you've had any side effects, just kind of your experience about clinical trials.
Yeah, great question. I'll try to keep it brief so we get to as many questions as we can. So I am very fortunate. I've been on a clinical trial, which is a combination therapy for almost 6 years. I have had See, I'm stopping myself being my own advocate. I tend to say I've had virtually no side effects, but of course I have. Um, in the first several months, my blood counts crashed, and my doctor
Mm,
started to see me once a week instead of seeing every 3 weeks. She, again, as an expert, knew to be patient because it's not that I couldn't tolerate those drugs as a community oncologist typically would have taken me off those drugs and said, nope, she can't tolerate it. We don't want her blood counts, particularly white counts and platelets so low. She knew as an expert to watch very carefully because they are likely to slowly come up. And they did. And my blood counts are in the normal range. It took a long time, but I like to say I'm happy to be boring, right? Nothing's
yeah,
abnormal right now. Lots is abnormal, in a bone marrow, but I'm boring, right? So I have been very fortunate. The side effects that people don't like to talk much about, again, a yes and no question from your doctor when you enter a clinical trial. They'll meet with you regularly, and the care team, the study team will meet with you, and they'll ask you things like, have you had diarrhea? Have you had this? Have you that? Nobody likes to talk about GI problems that
mm,
whether it's diarrhea or constipation, and with drugs, mostly it's diarrhea. And if I was asked that question early on, I would have said yes, but along the way, I would have said no. But the truth is, it's not a mild thing. It's not something that, oh yes, well, I've been in a little pain. It keeps you, it's a lifestyle issue. In my line of work, I would be hosting a live webinar and oh my God, am I going to be in the bathroom stuck and not be able to be online live? And so this is a candid conversation, but a really important one, because if you share it with your care team, if you're on a clinical trial, it might be a reason to adjust the dose as opposed to having to leave that clinical trial. So two things I want to share about clinical trials. Number one, today's world, clinical trials are not a last resort. The
yeah,
greatest new treatments are in clinical trials, and that's because our science is moving so fast. It's not like before when, they're moving so fast, newest, best treatments, check out clinical trials. The other thing that's important to know is because it's a cancer clinical trial, if you start looking at them, it's not a placebo. You're not choosing best available care versus something new that you don't know enough about. You always get the standard of care. I am on Jakafi, standard of care. They added a drug. They didn't take
Hmm.
away the standard of care. And that's important for peace of mind.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common misconception that people have of, oh, I'm going to get a placebo. And
Yeah.
that's not the case. You are still going to get the standard of care, or you're going to get the new, hopefully better than standard of care. So thanks for bringing that one up because I see that question all the time. And I love dispelling those myths about clinical trials. Um, and then next up, we have, so this is also related to symptoms, but just have you struggled with an enlarged spleen or liver or some of the symptoms that you have had over the last 30 or so years? Um, how did you advocate for yourself in those situations? How did you manage those things? Because many patients are having to.
Yeah, another great question. I've actually had symptoms since I was a child, though I wasn't diagnosed till I was 38. I had bone pain that people used to say call growing pains, right? Oh, you just have growing pains. When I got older and I would be explain bone pain, I was told, well, you know, arthritis runs in your family. I even went to a rheumatologist who told me it was probably arthritis, and I would get almost angry and say, no, you're not listening. It's not
Mhm.
my joints that hurt, it's my bones hurt, and it's different, right? So more about advocating. Don't accept what you're told, push for what the fact is and how you're really feeling, right? So other symptoms, fatigue, extreme fatigue, which is true with many blood cancers. Again, advocate, what does that extreme fatigue mean to you? A doctor will say, have you been tired? This isn't tired. This is, I'm too tired to lift my arm. It's exhausting to leave my arm. I missed my I had identical twin boy grandsons born a few years ago, and I missed their 2-year-old birthday party because I couldn't get out of the house that day. Right? These are very real things, and we need to talk about them so that we know that people in our lives understand them. That's part of advocacy. But also part of advocacy is explaining that to our care teams because they don't hear that I couldn't lift my arm. They hear, oh, she's tired, and they tick a box.
Yeah. And I think, again, these symptoms that people are living with oftentimes get dismissed
Yeah,
of fatigue is a big one, especially within the MPN world. It's I've talked with plenty of specialists that are like, yeah, we know fatigue's a problem within the community. They recognize it, but I don't always know if they recognize to what extent it
exactly.
is. So really making sure that it's known of, hey, I am like I'm not tired. This is a next level.
Yeah.
Really
I,
pushing for that.
yeah, I have a great short story. It happens to be in my book, but I love this story. A woman I know who's become a friend who has CLL, has had it for decades, and she's doing well. And she recently, as of the writing of this chapter at least, got together with a couple of close friends for lunch, and and one of them said, "Well, wow, you know, you're so lucky you just never felt bad through this whole ordeal." And again, it's hard to keep your eyebrows, right, raised eyebrows from freezing in place. It's that she was floored by her friends because these were days that she couldn't get out of bed. These were days that she'd take a nap in the afternoon and set her alarm so she'd get up at 4 p.m. when her son got off the school bus, right? So she was floored. And what she realized is that's on me. I haven't told them how I feel. And to me, that's a really great lesson. These were her besties, and she had never really told them how she was struggling.
Yeah. And I think just finding the right words can be hard, and that actually leads into a really good question here. I apologize if I don't answer your question. So Ruth is a patient advocate. She is not going to be giving out medical advice today. So if I'm skipping over some questions, that is why. This is really just learning how to be an advocate and that experience. So we're going to focus our questions on that today. But um, this individual says, how do you explain the fatigue to others?
Mm.
So how do you handle that?
Yeah, well, today I just gave you two great examples. I mean, everything is graphic, right? we're very visual beings. And if you show somebody that it's exhausting to lift your arm, it's pretty hard to miss what that means, right? If I say I miss my 2-year-olds, my identical twin boys, the cutest boys in the world, and I missed their 2-year-old birthday party, all day long I wanted to go. I literally couldn't get out of my recliner. And I hate recliners, by the way, but I bought one because I needed it, right? Think of examples. Think of how far you could walk before and now I can't. Think about how perhaps you couldn't and now you can. Let's make it more hopeful, right? I'm feeling
Yeah.
great. Let's use that example. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to dance at my son's wedding. 5 years ago, I couldn't walk up the street without stopping to hold on to a lamppost. And now I'm much stronger and that fatigue has gotten better. But I still need to communicate to people when I'm with friends and they can do a lot more than I can, whether it's hiking or doing whatever. I might be able to do something, but I'm always going to be slower. I'm always going to not be able to go as far. And so I've learned to be very vocal. And guess what? The people in your life appreciate that because they don't know. They
Yeah.
don't know you're struggling if you don't tell them.
Yeah. And that's something that I've heard from a lot of other people. And I was fortunate enough to host an event with a psychologist who specializes in working in oncology patients. And something that she spoke about is kind of becoming an advocate for yourself. And when having these conversations with the people around you, a lot of them mean well and they want to help. They want to say the right thing, but they don't always know how.
Yeah.
So sometimes you really do have to be the one to guide that, to say, I am feeling this way. And having some of those stories to go along with that can really be helpful. Or I need help with this specific thing can really help people because people mean well, but they're not always able to fully comprehend when they're not going through it. So
Yeah.
awesome. And then, um, so this will probably be, this is more of a comment, but I just wanted to share this. Um, but this person says, I appreciate what you're doing by writing about MPNs. I was diagnosed with ET at 32 years old, 9 months post C-section, and I was labeled with preeclampsia during my first pregnancy. I've progressed to myelofibrosis at the age of 65, but doing well so far. I'm a DNP prepared nurse practitioner and advocate for women to not be labeled preeclamptic instead of for providers looking for the root cause of the symptoms. I'll be writing an article for the appropriate journal soon. So thank you. So just the importance of advocacy is, I don't think we can understate that, especially after hearing from you today. Being an advocate it is incredibly vital.
And thank you for that question or for that comment. It's one of these I go like this because we can all do our part. We all have expertise, whether it's writing an journal article as a medical professional, or it's me as a health writer who's become an advocate, a social worker. We all have friends who have expertise in areas that maybe we can tap into them. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah. And I think we're coming up pretty close to the end of our time here. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the Q&A. But thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to go ahead for everyone in the audience and share, making sure I do this correctly on Zoom. But I'm going to drop the link to Ruth's website where you can learn a little bit more about her as well. I'm assuming your book is in there. So for people that are interested in picking up the Big C Squared, want to make it as easy as possible for them. And in the
Thank
follow-up email, I'll include your link as well so that people can find you.
Thank you. If I can just say my thanks to you and to HealthTree, and thanks to everybody who's attended today. It's such a pleasure. I mean, believe me, I didn't write this book for the $2 that I'm going to make on each book. I
Yeah.
wrote it to get it into more people's hands. And so I encourage you to share. If you do read it, wonderful. If you just take away with whatever we talked about today, share those things with the people in your life, and that's how we build community.
Yeah. And that's that's really what I wanted out of today is an opportunity to build community and to show that advocacy is vital, especially living with these chronic cancers. It's something that I think is really, really important in order to ensure the best care, not just for yourself, but really help others as well. So thank you for all that you do in that space.
Thank you.
All right. And we're going to go ahead and start wrapping up here. So we have a couple more upcoming educational events. I just picked a few here. But the first one is Finding Strength in Community, How Support Networks Empower Myeloma Patients, and that'll be on July 9th. And then the next one is Primary versus Secondary Myelofibrosis, Similarities and Differences, and that'll be on July 23rd. So if you are interested in either of those, you can go onto the HealthTree website and register for them there. I'm sure they'll both be wonderful events. We also are going to be doing or have that survey at the end when you leave the Zoom call today. So please take a moment to fill that out. It really does help us when we're trying to figure out what to do with these events. Um, and then the HealthTree Connect, if you scan this QR code here, this is an opportunity for you to join a social media platform specifically for your blood cancer and really hopefully find a sense of community there. So if you're interested in joining HealthTree Connect, you can go ahead and scan that. We'll also have a link to HealthTree Connect and our follow-up email. And then a big thank you to our sponsors again. Truly, we wouldn't be able to do these events without them. So those are all listed here. And finally, I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank Ruth for coming on and sharing. Truly, that was incredible to hear from you.
My pleasure.
And and thank you to everyone for being part of our community here at HealthTree. We are we're really trying to do our best that we can to show that we're here for the community in every way that we can be. So if you ever have any suggestions for things that you'd like us to tackle, you can go ahead and reach out to us. I have my email up on the screen here. If you just want someone to chat with, I'm always available. But yeah, just thank you to everyone for spending some time with us today. So I appreciate you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you soon.